In the unforgiving heartland of industry, where fortunes are forged in steel and shattered by ego, a new legend is about to be told. Before the engine roars to life, offer your tribute. If you believe in the triumph of the underdog, show your support with a like. Join our community by subscribing so you won't miss the secrets buried deep within the machine. Now, prepare yourselves for the silence before the storm. The silence was the worst part. It was a physical thing, a heavy blanket woven from 1,000 pairs of staring eyes, smothering the cavernous hall of the Agri-Mech Expo 2024. The air, just moments before electric with anticipation, and the scent of ozone from the spotlights, now hung thick and stagnant with the metallic tang of failure. On the polished central dais, under a banner that screamed Titanex, the future of harvest, the $5 million machine sat inert. It was a behemoth of chrome and gold-painted steel, a monument to ambition that had just died with a pathetic, grinding cough, a death rattle amplified into an echoing whimper by the state-of-the-art sound system. Julian Sterling, CEO of Sterling Innovations, felt a single bead of sweat trace a cold, deliberate path down his temple, carving a channel through his expensive foundation. The microphone in his hand felt like a lead weight, an anchor pulling him down into the abyss of public humiliation. His smile, a dazzlingly white construction of confidence and venture capital, was frozen on his face, a rictus of impending doom. He had promised disruption. He had promised a revolution. He had promised to consign the combustion engine to the dustbin of history. Instead, he had delivered a monumentally expensive paperweight, a gilded tombstone for his own career. There are truths that only reveal themselves when everything we know falls apart. For Julian, the truth was simple and terrifying. He was a fraud, a brilliant salesman of other men's ghosts, and the whole world was about to find out. From the far edge of the hall, near a service corridor reeking of industrial cleaner, Elias Thorne watched the spectacle unfold. He leaned on his mop, the worn wood smooth and familiar in his calloused hands, a silent partner in his 30-year exile. To everyone here, he was just part of the scenery, a ghost in a gray jumpsuit, tasked with erasing the scuffs and spills left by important people treading on their own polished reflections. But as he looked at the Titanex, he wasn't seeing a machine. He was seeing a memory, a phantom limb he hadn't felt in decades. He could feel the engine's aborted shudder in his own bones, a phantom pain that resonated with a hurt buried 3 decades deep, a betrayal that had left him a walking ruin. The machine wasn't just broken, it was suffering, its internal harmony violently disrupted. It was being asked to do something it was never designed for, by people who didn't understand its language. And Elias Thorne, more than anyone else in that suffocatingly silent room, could hear it scream. It was a scream he knew intimately, for it was the echo of his own. Julian Sterling's mind raced, a frantic scramble through a Rolodex of blame. It was the engineers. It had to be. A team of bright young things from MIT and Stanford, heads full of code and algorithms but hands that had never held a wrench, never felt the visceral feedback of a misfiring cylinder through their own flesh and bone. He could see them huddled near the side of the stage, their faces pale, frantically tapping on tablets that were now as useless as the degrees they were still paying off. He had hired them for their pedigrees, for the way they looked in the company prospectus. He had never once asked if they could listen. He turned away from the dead machine, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth, his voice a low, venomous hiss meant only for his senior VP, a portly man named Gerald whose own sweat stains were blooming like dark continents on his silk shirt. Get them out of my sight, all of them. Incompetent children playing with toys they don't understand. I want their security passes revoked before their asses hit the parking lot. His eyes scanned the crowd, a predator searching for a weaker animal to sacrifice to the pack. He saw investors, men with checkbooks a mile long who, just an hour ago, were slapping his back, now looking at him with the cold, calculating appraisal of a butcher eyeing a side of beef. He saw reporters, their phones held up like a forest of black mirrors, capturing every second of his corporate crucifixion, no doubt already crafting the headlines. Sterling's folly asterisk tight neck sinks, and then his desperate, darting gaze snagged on him. The old man, the janitor. He was just standing there, an island of stillness in the churning sea of Julian's disaster, leaning on his mop, his gaze fixed not on the flashy, dead console but lower on the massive engine block, near the exhaust manifold. There was a look on the old man's face, not curiosity, not the morbid pity of the others. It was something deeper, a pained recognition, like seeing a beloved friend publicly mistreated. The sight of this menial worker, this nobody, so engrossed, so knowing, was a match to the gasoline of Julian's fury. This was it, the perfect scapegoat, an object of ridicule to deflect the crushing spotlight of failure. He raised the microphone, a cruel smirk twisting his lips, the showman finding his final, desperate act. The speakers crackled to life, amplifying his voice into a weapon. "Well, folks," he began, his tone dripping with a forced, toxic joviality, "it seems even the future has technical difficulties." A few nervous, sycophantic chuckles rippled through the crowd. But maybe we've been looking in the wrong place for a solution. Maybe we've been relying too much on credentials. He pointed a dramatic, manicured finger towards the edge of the room, the spotlight operator, catching his cue, swinging a harsh beam onto the unsuspecting janitor. "You there, the janitor." Every head, 1,000 of them, turned in unison. Elias felt the weight of their collective stare land on him like a physical blow. He didn't flinch, but his grip tightened on the mop handle, the wood groaning softly. He had spent years, decades, cultivating invisibility, a quiet life in the shadows where the ghosts of his past couldn't find him. That life was now over, immolated in the harsh glare of a spotlight. "Yes, you old man," Sterling continued, his voice booming with false confidence, savoring the moment. "You seem fascinated by my machine. Find a spill you missed." The crowd, sensing a blood sport, sensing that the humiliation was being transferred from the man in the $1,000 suit to the man in the threadbare jumpsuit, laughed more freely this time. It was a sound of relief and cruelty. Elias remained silent, his pale blue eyes, which had seen the birth and death of countless engines, which had memorized the schematics for machines that hadn't been built yet, fixed on Sterling. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Sterling strutted a few steps closer, leaving the safety of the dais and descending toward his target. "Tell us, what deep insights are you gleaning from back there? Got a theory on its quantum processing failure? Perhaps you've noticed a misalignment in its neural network." He was close enough now to see the grease permanently ingrained in the old man's knuckles, the slight, weary limp in his posture from an injury Sterling's own father had indirectly caused. He reeked of quiet dignity and floor cleaner, and Julian Sterling hated him for it. "Come on, share your wisdom with us all. What would a janitor know about quantum agriculture?" The line landed like a punch, and the laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, the sound of a pack turning on the designated victim. Elias finally lowered his gaze from the machine and looked directly at Julian Sterling. In that quiet, unwavering stare, there was no fear, no shame. There was only a profound, ancient sadness, the look of a creator seeing his work corrupted and mocked. Sterling felt a flicker of unease, a prickle on his skin. He had expected the man to shrink, to stammer, to scurry away like the vermin he was. This silent judgment was unnerving. He had to regain control, to push the joke to its conclusion and reassert his dominance, to drown that quiet judgment in a tidal wave of ridicule. The laughter was a wave, and Julian Sterling, a desperate surfer, rode it, feeling a surge of borrowed power. He was no longer the failed CEO on the stage. He was the ringmaster, and this sad old man was his clown. He had to double down to turn this excruciating, career-ending failure into an unforgettable, albeit humiliating, spectacle. It was the only play he had left in a book full of stolen ideas. "You know what?" he boomed into the microphone, his voice echoing with a false, manic magnanimity. "I'm a disruptor. I believe in radical opportunities, in thinking outside the box." He swept his arm towards the silent, golden behemoth, a gesture worthy of a Roman emperor. "Forget my overpaid, underperforming engineers." He shot a venomous glare at the huddle of young tech graduates who looked as if they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. One of them, a young man named Ben, met his gaze for a fraction of a second with something that wasn't fear but contempt before looking away. Julian filed it away. He would be fired first. "I'm crowdsourcing the solution." The crowd buzzed, a mixture of confusion and morbid curiosity. They were no longer watching a tech launch. They were watching a public meltdown, a corporate immolation, and it was far more entertaining. "Come on, old man," Sterling gestured with a flourish, a showman playing to the cheap seats. "Don't be shy. You were staring at her like a long-lost love. You must see something we don't. Some speck of dust on the flux capacitor, perhaps." Elias didn't move. The world had compressed into the space between him and the machine. The noise, the faces, the ridicule, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. All he could hear was the strained silence of the engine, the memory of its perfect hum. A symphony of controlled combustion he had orchestrated with his own hands 30 years ago in a small, greasy workshop that was the only home he'd ever loved. He felt the familiar pull, the engineer's oath, a duty not to a company or a man but to the machine itself. An engine is a living thing, he'd always believed. It has a voice, a rhythm, a soul. And this one, his one, was being tortured. Sterling, mistaking the old man's profound stillness for fear, pressed his advantage. He walked right up to Elias, invading his personal space, the scent of his expensive, citrus and musk cologne, a jarring offense against the honest smell of floor cleaner and old oil. "I'll make you a deal." His voice dropped into a conspiratorial, mocking whisper that the microphone still caught and amplified, turning the entire audience into co-conspirators. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He turned back to the audience, his smile wide and predatory. "Hey, everyone, you are all my witnesses. This is a binding verbal contract." He raised his voice again, projecting to the back of the hall. "My lead engineer, the one with the 6-figure student debt, says the core calibration is fried. A 6-week fix minimum. Probably needs a full system teardown." The laughter was now a deafening roar. Sterling leaned in close to Elias, his breath hot and smelling of coffee and panic. "So here it is, my final offer, the ultimate disruption." He jabbed a thumb back at the Titanex, gleaming under the spotlights. "Go ahead, fix it. If you can start this $5 million pile of junk." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the delicious absurdity of the proposition sink in. "I will sign the title over to you. Right here, right now. It's yours." A collective gasp went through the hall, followed by another explosion of laughter and scattered applause. The sheer, insane ridiculousness of it was perfect. The cornered CEO was betting his company's flagship product, the culmination of years of research and development, against a janitor with a mop. It was theater of the absurd, a corporate Rasputin moment. Sterling felt a smug, intoxicating sense of victory. He had successfully deflected all attention from his own failure. The narrative was no longer about a faulty machine. It was about a mad CEO's grand gesture. Now, the old man would either slink away in shame, proving his irrelevance, or he would fumble with the machine for a minute before giving up, cementing Sterling's narrative that the problem was impossibly complex, a challenge only his genius could eventually overcome. Either way, Julian Sterling won. He held out his hand, a grand, magnanimous gesture as if to shake on the deal. "What do you say, Pops? You and me. The little guy gets a shot at the title. Got the guts." For the first time, Elias Thorne moved. He didn't look at Sterling's outstretched, manicured hand. He looked past him at the Titanex, at his legacy, painted gold and stripped of its soul. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded. A single, almost imperceptible dip of his chin. It was not an acceptance of a bet. It was the answer to a call. A hush fell over the crowd, a silence far more profound than the one that had followed the machine's failure. This was a silence of anticipation. Elias Thorne took his hand off the mop. He let it lean against a nearby support pillar with a quiet clatter that seemed to cannon through the silent hall. He didn't look at Julian Sterling. He didn't look at the thousands of expectant faces, the sea of smartphones all pointed at him. His focus was singular, absolute, a beam of pure intent aimed at the dais. He began to walk. Each step was measured, deliberate. The slight limp, a relic of a long-ago workshop accident when a 2-ton engine block had slipped its chains and crushed his leg, seemed not a sign of weakness but of a long, hard-fought journey. The crowd, a living organism, parted for him like the Red Sea, a path of polished concrete opening from the edge of the room to the stage. The soft scuff of his worn work boots on the floor was the only sound. He was no longer a janitor. He was a priest approaching an altar. Sterling watched, a knot of confusion and a new, unfamiliar dread tightening in his stomach. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The old man was supposed to be a prop, a punchline to a terrible joke. But the way he walked, the sheer, unnerving gravity of his presence, was changing the atmosphere in the room. The air of mockery was evaporating, being replaced by a tense, electric curiosity. What in God's name was he doing? Elias reached the stage and, ignoring the small set of portable stairs Sterling had used, placed a gnarled hand on the edge of the dais and hoisted himself up with the surprising, wiry strength of a man accustomed to a lifetime of physical labor. He stood before the Titanex, a small gray figure dwarfed by the gleaming, overwrought monstrosity. He ran a hand over the cold, gold-painted fender, his touch gentle, reverent, as if greeting an old, wounded animal. The young engineers watched him, their faces a mixture of pity, disbelief, and a dawning, terrifying professional horror. One of them, the young man Ben, whispered to his colleague, "What's he going to do?" "Check the oil. The battery connection is hardwired to the primary power cell. There are no user-serviceable parts." Sterling's team had designed the Titanex to be a seamless black box, an appliance. There were no buttons, no knobs, no keys. Its functions were controlled by a 24-inch touchscreen tablet embedded in the cockpit, which was currently displaying a single, mocking error message in a stark, futuristic font. Core synchronization failure. Elias ignored the screen completely. He didn't even glance at the sleek, ergonomic cockpit. To him, that was just the frivolous skin, the marketing. He was interested in the heart. He walked around the massive vehicle, his eyes tracing lines Sterling's designers had never considered important. The flow of the hydraulic lines, the placement of the main air intake, the precise angle of the exhaust manifold. His gaze was a diagnostic tool far more sophisticated than any computer. He stopped, his gaze fixed on the main engine housing. It was a beautiful, powerful block, a V12 diesel hybrid based on his own design from a lifetime ago. Sterling's people had scanned it, 3D modeled it, and replicated it down to the last millimeter. But they hadn't understood it. They had copied the words without knowing the language. He reached into the deep pocket of his gray jumpsuit. The faint jingle of keys, a small, worn pocket knife, and something else, something small and hard. His fingers closed around a familiar object. He pulled it out. It wasn't a tool. It wasn't a key. It was a simple, flat steel washer, no bigger than a penny. It was worn smooth at the edges from 30 years of writing in his pocket, a relic from his old workshop, a habit he'd never broken, always carry a shim, just in case. He held it up to the light for a moment, a small circle of humble, ordinary metal against the multi-million-dollar spectacle. This was his diagnosis. Not a line of code, not a sensor reading, but a fundamental truth of mechanics, of physics, that Sterling's generation had forgotten in their rush to replace the physical with the digital. Elias moved with an economy of motion that bespoke decades of practice, a ballet of mechanical grace. He knelt, his bad knee protesting with a dull, familiar ache he had long ago learned to ignore. His hands, though old and scarred, were as steady as a surgeon's as he reached deep into the machine's guts, his fingers navigating the labyrinth of wires and hoses with an instinct that transcended sight. He didn't need a schematic. He was the schematic. The engine block, the Thorne Dynamics Model 7, was as familiar to him as the lines on his own face. He had designed it for power, yes, but its true genius was its harmony. Every component was engineered to work in concert, its vibrations meticulously calculated and canceled out by counter-vibrations, creating a stable, resonant frequency that was the key to its legendary durability and efficiency. It was designed to purr, not to scream. Sterling's team, in their digital replication, had copied the form but had been utterly blind to the function. They had upgraded the fuel injectors, tweaked the turbocharger settings, and bolted on a powerful hybrid electric motor, increasing the revolutions per minute by nearly 15%. They saw it as an improvement, an optimization, a disruption of an older, inefficient design. Elias saw it for what it was, a desecration. They had changed the engine's heartbeat without adjusting the resonance of its body. The crowd leaned in, a single collective body holding its breath. What was he doing down there? Sterling craned his neck, squinting, trying to see past the massive tires. "What is he fiddling with?" he muttered to Gerald. "There are no user-serviceable parts in there. He's going to electrocute himself. Get security ready." Elias' fingers found it. The harmonic balancer, a precisely weighted wheel on the end of the crankshaft, designed to absorb the torsional vibrations inherent in any internal combustion engine. On his original design, it was calibrated with a series of small, adjustable counterweights that could be minutely tuned in the field. Sterling's team had replaced it with a sleek, self-calibrating digital unit that was now utterly, hopelessly confused by the engine's new, discordant frequency. The unit was trying to compensate, but its algorithm was flawed. It was making things worse, creating a micro-oscillation, a high-frequency shudder so fine it was almost imperceptible to the naked eye, but so violent at a molecular level that it was tearing the engine apart from the inside. That was the source of the core synchronization failure. The engine's physical sensors were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong, and the central computer, unable to find a corresponding software error in its pristine code, did the only thing it could. It shut everything down. It was a safety protocol. The machine was trying to save itself from its own masters. He found the small access plate on the balancer's housing, a feature he had insisted on for manual field adjustments, a feature Sterling's team had probably dismissed as a quaint, unnecessary relic of the analog age. He worked it open with a blackened thumbnail. Inside, a small flywheel was visibly vibrating, a blur of deadly, pent-up energy. This was the source of the agony. He took the steel washer from his palm. It was the perfect thickness, the perfect weight. He didn't need calipers to know. He knew. With a surgeon's precision, he carefully, precisely, slid the washer into a tiny gap on the damper's mounting bracket, wedging it firmly against the casing. It was a crude fix, an analog solution to a digital problem. It wouldn't fix the root cause, the imbalanced design, but it would change the resonant mass of the assembly just enough. It would absorb the rogue vibration, calming the storm inside the machine. He whispered to the cold metal, a prayer only he and the engine could hear. "There now, girl, I know. They gave you too much fire and no rhythm. She's shaking herself to death. Let's calm you down." He pulled his hand back out, his knuckles now smeared with fresh grease. He stood up slowly, brushing the dust from the knees of his jumpsuit. He had done all he could. The rest was up to her. Elias walked with purpose to the side of the engine block, to a small, unassuming panel that every single one of Sterling's bright young engineers had overlooked during the assembly. It was labeled in small, stamped letters, "Manual Override / Service Start." In their obsession with sleek, buttonless, Apple-inspired design, they had considered it a vestigial feature, a necessary evil for deep-level diagnostics only, and had hidden it behind a magnetically sealed plate designed to blend seamlessly with the casing. Elias popped it open with a fingernail. Behind it was not a button, but a simple keyhole and a small, sturdy, fold-out crank handle. This was the soul of the machine, the direct, physical link to its heart, bypassing the entire digital nervous system that was currently holding it hostage. This was how you started a Thorne engine. You didn't press a button, you engaged with it. You felt its resistance, its compression. You earned its roar. He took a set of keys from his pocket, the keys to his small, barren apartment, the janitor's closet at the expo center, and one other. A simple, old-fashioned steel key, its head worn smooth from 30 years of silent partnership. The original master key for the TD Model 7 prototype. He had kept it all this time, a relic of a buried life. He slotted the key into the ignition. It fit perfectly, a homecoming of metal on metal. He gripped the crank handle, his old muscles coiling with memory. He gave it a firm, powerful turn. For a moment, there was nothing but the mechanical sound of the crank engaging the flywheel. A deep, guttural clunk asterisk. Then, a cough. A single, explosive burst of combustion that smelled of diesel and ozone and hope. The crowd flinched. Sterling, seeing the single puff of smoke, let out a short, derisive laugh. "See, nothing, a backfire." Elias ignored him. He knew the engine. The first cough was just her clearing her throat. He gave the crank another turn, putting his back into it this time, his feet planted, feeling the immense compression of the 12 cylinders fighting him, a familiar and welcome struggle. Then he turned the key. A deafening explosion ripped through the hall. It wasn't the groan of before. It was a roar, a deep, earth-shaking, primal sound of perfectly controlled power. The Titan X didn't just start, it erupted into life. The polished concrete floor vibrated, a tremor running through the souls of every person in the building. The spotlights flickered under the sudden, massive power draw. The machine settled into a low, rumbling idle, a sound as smooth and steady as a giant predator's purr. It was a sound of perfect balance, of immense power held in effortless reserve. The sound was so pure, so powerful, it stunned the hall into silence for a second time. But this was not the silence of failure. It was the silence of awe. Then the dam broke. The crowd erupted. It was a spontaneous, unified explosion of applause, whistles, and shouts. They weren't just clapping for a machine that worked. They were cheering for the impossible. They were cheering for the quiet, forgotten old man who had just performed a miracle with a piece of scrap metal and an old key. Julian Sterling stood frozen, his face a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. The sound of the engine was the sound of his own ruin. It was perfect, too perfect. The hum was cleaner, more stable than he had ever heard it, even in the top-secret, multi-million-dollar simulations. How was this possible? His engineers were staring, their mouths agape, their expensive tablets forgotten on the floor. They were looking at the old man not as a janitor, but as some kind of wizard, a shaman who spoke to machines. In that moment of transcendent noise, Elias Thorne wasn't looking at the crowd or at Sterling. His eyes were closed, a small, sad smile on his tired face. He had one hand resting on the engine housing, feeling the steady, healthy thrum of its heartbeat against his palm. He had not just started a machine, he had saved a life. The glorious roar of the engine slowly subsided as Elias, with a final, gentle pat on its casing as if calming a horse, turned the key back, bringing the massive V12 to a graceful, humming stop. The resulting silence was a different entity now, filled not with tension but with 1,000 excited whispers. The applause had died down, replaced by a feverish buzz of speculation. Who was this man? How had he done it? In the front row, amidst a block of silver-haired investors from a powerful agricultural consortium, a man named Arthur Abernathy slowly, painfully, got to his feet. He was in his late 70s, with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of countless corporate empires. He had been in this business since tractors had carburetors and billion-dollar deals were sealed with a single handshake. He stared at the dais, not at the machine, but at the old man in the gray jumpsuit, his face pale with shock and a dawning, impossible recognition. "My God," Abernathy whispered to the man next to him, his voice raspy with age and disbelief. He fumbled for the microphone on the table in front of him, his hand shaking. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter with the authority of old money. The hall fell silent again, all eyes turning to the venerable investor. "Mr. Sterling," Abernathy began, his gaze still locked on Elias, "you and your team have been struggling with this engine for months, have you not? Unexplained vibrations, sensor failures, catastrophic shutdowns in testing." Julian, still reeling from the impossible event, could only manage a numb, stupid nod. His mind was a blank slate of pure panic. "I thought so," Abernathy continued, a grim satisfaction in his tone. He then looked directly at Elias, his voice softening with something that sounded like reverence. "That fix, that trick with the harmonic balancer, shimming it with a washer to alter the resonant frequency." He shook his head in wonder. There was only one man who knew that trick. It was his signature, a field-expedient solution he designed for the original prototypes when their calibration was off. A brilliant, analog patch for a problem that shouldn't have existed if the block was cast correctly. Abernathy took a step into the aisle, his voice growing stronger, more certain, resonating with the weight of buried history. He pointed a trembling, liver-spotted finger at the janitor. "That is not a janitor." Every phone, every camera, every eye in the room was now fixed on Elias Thorne. 30 years ago, the most brilliant agricultural engineer of his generation founded a company called Thorne Dynamics. He designed an engine block so advanced, so perfectly balanced, that we are still trying to catch up to it today. The TD Model 7, but he was pushed out in a hostile takeover orchestrated by a man who valued assets over genius. His name was scrubbed from the patents, his legacy buried. We all thought he just disappeared, drank himself to death, some said. Abernathy's voice resonated with the righteous anger of a man who had seen a great injustice and had been powerless to stop it. But I would recognize that man anywhere. The way he stands, the way he looks at an engine, Ladies and gentlemen, that is Elias Thorne. He didn't just fix the engine. He's the man who built it in the first place. The revelation hit the room like a physical shockwave. Elias Thorne, the founder, the ghost, the legend whispered about by old-timers in the industry. It was him. He was here dressed as a janitor, cleaning the floors at an event showcasing his own stolen legacy. The implications were staggering. A story so perfect, so cinematic, it couldn't possibly be real, and yet it was. The Titanex wasn't a Sterling innovation. It was a Thorne Dynamics legacy. And Julian Sterling, the self-proclaimed disruptor, was nothing but a common grave robber. Elias stood quietly, the wave of recognition washing over him. He hadn't wanted this. He had only wanted to silence the machine's pain, to correct a flaw that was an insult to his life's work. But the past, it seemed, had a way of refusing to stay buried. He finally turned to face Julian Sterling, his expression unreadable, and for the first time since the ordeal began, he prepared to speak. Elias' life unspooled in his mind in the moments before he spoke, a cascade of greasy, painful memories. He remembered the thrill of the early days, the smell of hot metal and cutting fluid in his small workshop, the long nights spent hunched over drafting tables, chasing a vision of mechanical perfection. Thorne Dynamics had been his child, born from grease, sweat, and an unshakable belief that a machine could have integrity, a soul. The Model 7 engine was his masterpiece. It wasn't just a collection of parts, it was a symphony in steel. He'd poured his soul into balancing its crankshaft, tuning its harmonics, ensuring that every ounce of its immense power was delivered with grace and efficiency. Then came the money men. Julian Sterling's father, Marcus Sterling, a corporate raider with a shark smile, and eyes that saw everything as an asset to be stripped and sold for parts. Marcus hadn't seen the beauty in the engine. He'd seen patents to be acquired, a brand to be dismantled, and a competitor to be crushed into dust. He'd bought out Elias' partners with promises of fortunes they couldn't refuse, leveraged the company into a debt it could never repay, and then swallowed it whole in a brutal, meticulously planned takeover. Elias, who had refused to compromise his designs for the sake of cheaper production, who had screamed in a boardroom that using inferior-grade steel in the crankshaft would lead to catastrophic failure in 5 years, was deemed an obstacle, a sentimental fool. He was cast out of his own kingdom, forced to sign a non-compete agreement that was as ironclad as it was insulting, preventing him from working in agricultural engineering for the rest of his life. He lost everything: his company, his patents, his name. All that was left was the permanent limp from a falling engine block in the frantic, final days of the takeover, a painful souvenir, and the quiet, gnawing grief of a creator separated from his creation. For 30 years, he had drifted. He worked menial jobs, always staying close to the world of machines, a ghost haunting the edges of the industry he had helped build. He took the janitor job at the expo center out of a morbid, self-destructive curiosity, hearing whispers that Sterling Innovations was unveiling something revolutionary. He had to see, and when he saw the Titanex, he knew. He recognized the shape of the engine block, the unique bolt pattern on the housing. It was his Model 7, stolen, resurrected, and perverted. Julian, who inherited the company and its portfolio of stolen intellectual property, had likely found the old schematics in a forgotten digital archive, a vintage designed to be disrupted. The boy had no idea what he was holding. He saw a blueprint, not a living soul. Now, standing on the stage, the silence of the room was a vacuum waiting to be filled. Elias looked at Julian Sterling, who was staring at him with a dawning, horrified understanding. The CEO's face, usually a mask of smug confidence, was crumbling like wet sand. The sweat was no longer a single bead, but a sheen of cold, panicked perspiration plastering his perfect hair to his forehead. "You painted it gold, Julian." Elias' voice was quiet, yet it carried across the hall with impossible clarity. It was rough, like an engine that hadn't been run in years, but it was steady. You gave it a fancy screen and a new name, but you didn't balance the crank. He took a step closer, his limp more pronounced now, a rhythm keeping time with the weight of his words. "Your father stole my company, but he was smart enough to know what he didn't know. He mothballed the designs, but you were arrogant enough to think you could improve on perfection." He gestured to the silent machine. "You ran the simulations, you copied the schematics, but you never listened to it. You increased the power, but you didn't understand the harmony. An engine isn't just data, boy. It has a voice, a rhythm, a soul." He pointed a greasy finger at the harmonic balancer he had just fixed. "You stole the design, but you forgot the soul. That's why it was screaming, and that's why it shut itself down. It would rather die than run wrong." Each word was a nail being hammered into the coffin of Julian Sterling's career. The investors were looking at him with open contempt. The reporters were scribbling furiously, their faces alight with the orgasmic thrill of a career-making scandal. The young engineers whom Sterling had berated were now looking at Elias with something approaching religious reverence. Sterling had built his entire brand on being a visionary, a genius who saw the future. In the space of 10 minutes, this old janitor had exposed him as a hollow echo, a plagiarist who didn't even understand the thing he had stolen. The Titanex wasn't the future of the harvest. It was the ghost of a brilliant past, and it had come back to haunt him into oblivion. The spell of silence broke. Julian Sterling, a cornered animal, lurched into a desperate, pathetic action. His survival instincts, honed in boardrooms and hostile negotiations, screamed at him. Damage control. Spin. Deny. He had to get ahead of this. The story couldn't be fraudulent CEO exposed by company's forgotten founder. It had to be visionary CEO honors humble genius in surprise reveal. Yes, that was it. A stunt. It was all a planned stunt. He forced a shaky, manic smile onto his face, a rictus of sheer terror. He grabbed the keys to the Titanex from his pocket, a sleek, useless key fob that did nothing but unlock the cabin door, and practically ran towards Elias, holding them out like a peace offering. "Incredible," he shouted into his microphone, his voice a half-octave too high, cracking with strain. "Absolutely incredible. Ladies and gentlemen, give another round of applause for Mr. Elias Thorne, a true legend we found working right under our own roof." The applause was sparse, uncertain, and laced with contempt. The crowd wasn't buying it. Sterling's desperation was a palpable stench in the air. He reached Elias and thrust the key fob into his hand, forcing the old man's fingers to close around it. "The bet stands. A man of my word. The machine is yours, Elias. A small token of our gratitude for your incredible and secret contribution to this project." He was babbling, his eyes wild with fear, darting around the room, seeing only judgment. The bad PR from this would be devastating. Investors would pull out. Lawsuits would fly from Abernathy and his consortium. But if he could make it seem like he was rewarding the old man, honoring him, he might just salvage something from the wreckage. He could frame it as rediscovering a lost genius, a feel-good story. Elias looked down at the plastic key fob in his calloused palm. It was light, cheap, and meaningless. A toy. He then looked up at Sterling, his pale blue eyes clear and calm. There was no anger in them, no triumph. There was only a quiet, profound pity for the hollow man standing before him. He held up the key fob between his thumb and forefinger and let it drop to the floor. It clattered with a hollow, plastic sound. "I don't want the machine," Elias said, his voice once again cutting through Sterling's frantic energy. The CEO froze, his manic smile collapsing. What? What are you talking about? It's a $5 million machine. It's yours, you won. It was never about winning, Elias said, turning his back on Sterling and addressing the silent machine, his machine. He ran his hand over the fender one last time. She's a good design, strong, honest. She just needs a master who understands her language, not a salesman who only knows how to shout. He then looked back at Sterling, and his gaze was as cold and hard as forged steel. You don't. He turned away from the CEO, from the machine, from the stage that had become his temporary throne. I didn't do this for a prize, he said, his voice for himself as much as anyone else. I just didn't want to hear it suffer anymore. This act of rejection was more powerful than any acceptance could have been. By refusing the prize, Elias stripped Sterling of his last shred of control. He couldn't be bought. He couldn't be spun. He had acted not out of greed or revenge, but out of principle, out of love for the work. He had proven that his dignity was not for sale at any price. It was a checkmate in a game Sterling hadn't even known they were playing. Elias Thorne walked off the dais, not bothering with the stairs. He simply stepped down onto the polished floor. The crowd parted for him again, but this time, the path they made was one of respect and awe. The whispers that followed him were no longer of ridicule, but of reverence. He walked with the same steady, limping gait, but he seemed taller now. The weight of 30 years of injustice lifted from his shoulders. The gray janitor's jumpsuit no longer looked like a uniform of servitude, but like the simple, practical garb of a master craftsman who had no need for suits or pretense. He didn't look back. He headed for the service corridor, for the quiet closet where his mop was still leaning against the wall. His work here was done. Behind him, the aftermath was swift and brutal, a corporate house of cards collapsing in a hurricane. Julian Sterling stood alone on the stage, a pariah in his own spotlight. Arthur Abernathy, the veteran investor, was the first to act. He walked calmly to the edge of the stage, his face a mask of cold fury. "Sterling," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of billions in capital. "My consortium's funding is withdrawn, effective immediately, and you can expect a lawsuit for securities fraud by morning. We invest in visionaries, not vultures." That was the first domino. Others followed with digital speed. Phones came out. Urgent, hushed conversations could be heard all over the hall. Sell Sterling innovations. Pull the offer. Cancel the contract. A reporter in the front row looked at his phone, his eyes wide. Holy hell, the stock is already down 60% in after-hours trading. The digital empire Julian had built on buzzwords and stolen ideas was crumbling in real time. The young engineers he had humiliated earlier, led by Ben, now looked at him with undisguised contempt before turning in unison and walking off the stage, leaving him completely alone with the silent, golden monument to his fraud. The reporters swarmed, a pack of sharks sensing blood in the water. "Mr. Sterling, is it true the Titanex is based on stolen patents? Mr. Sterling, how long have you known Elias Thorne worked for you as a janitor? What is your response to Abernathy's accusations of fraud?" Julian just stood there mute, as the flashbulbs went off like strobing explosions, capturing his complete and utter ruin for posterity. He was finished, bankrupt, over. By the time he finally stumbled off the stage, the hall was half empty. The investors were gone. The potential buyers were gone. All that remained were the gawkers and the media picking over the carcass of his career. He saw his senior VP, Gerald, in a heated argument with Expo security, his face purple with rage. The whole world had come crashing down because of one old man with a washer in his pocket. He looked toward the service corridor where Elias had disappeared. He had offered the man a $5 million machine, a fortune, and he had refused it. Sterling couldn't comprehend it. In his world, everything had a price. Everyone could be bought. The realization that there were people who operated on a different value system, one of integrity and purpose, was a concept so alien to him that it was more terrifying than the financial ruin he now faced. He had lost more than his company. He had lost the very foundation of his worldview, and he had nothing to replace it with. The ghost he had tried to mock had haunted him into oblivion. Elias walked away from the noise, the chaos, the sudden, unwelcome glare of fame. He found his closet, the small, quiet space that smelled of ammonia and damp rags. It had been his sanctuary. He took off the gray jumpsuit, folded it neatly, and left it on the shelf. He was done with being invisible. He put on his worn jacket and walked out the back exit of the expo center into the cool afternoon air. He didn't know what was next. Maybe he would find a small garage somewhere, a place where he could tinker, where he could feel the satisfying heft of a wrench in his hand again. The future was a blank, terrifying page. But for the first time in 30 years, he felt the crushing burden on his shoulders lift. The limp in his step felt less like a wound and more like a story. He had not sought vengeance, but justice had found him anyway. It was a quiet, personal victory that resonated far deeper than any public spectacle. The story of Elias Thorne and the Tightnecks became a legend in the industry overnight. A cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and engineering labs from Detroit to Dusseldorf. It was a story about the vast, unbridgeable canyon between imitation and creation, between branding and building. Julian Sterling's empire collapsed under the weight of lawsuits and scandal. Stripped of its stolen innovations, the company was revealed to be a hollow shell, and it was sold for parts, a poetic, final irony. Sterling himself disappeared from public life, a pariah in the world he had once sought to conquer. The incident sent ripples through the corporate world, a stark reminder that in the relentless pursuit of disruption, some companies had forgotten the fundamental value of experience. They had forgotten the wisdom held in calloused hands, the knowledge that cannot be coded or simulated. They had forgotten that true mastery isn't loud. It doesn't need a stage or a spotlight. It doesn't shout its own name. Arrogance shouts. It boasts and preens and paints things gold to hide their flaws. But mastery whispers. It speaks in the quiet language of perfectly balanced machines, of elegant solutions, of a simple steel washer placed in exactly the right spot. You cannot buy experience. You cannot download it. You have to earn it year by patient year, failure by painful failure. Elias Thorne had earned his, and in one quiet moment of profound integrity, he had reminded the entire world of that simple, unshakable truth. 6 months later, the name Thorne was back in the agricultural engineering world. Not in flashy headlines, but in quiet, reverent tones exchanged between farmers and mechanics, funded by a repentant Arthur Abernathy, who insisted it was the best investment he'd ever make. Elias had opened a small, specialized workshop in a forgotten industrial park outside of Des Moines. Thorne Mechanical Solutions. It wasn't a factory. It was a laboratory and a hospital for complex machines. Farmers and independent engineers from all over the country sent him their most challenging problems, the unfixable engines that modern diagnostics couldn't decipher. Elias, with a small team of young, eager apprentices he was teaching to listen to the machines, including a humbled and grateful Ben from Sterling's old team, solved them all. His workshop was clean, bright, and smelled perpetually of cutting oil and hot coffee. It was his heaven. One crisp autumn afternoon, a car pulled up outside, a modest, 10-year-old sedan, a far cry from the Italian sports cars he used to drive. Julian Sterling got out. He looked smaller, diminished. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a rumpled blazer and worn jeans. The arrogant swagger had been replaced by a weary hesitation. He stood for a long time on the sidewalk, just looking at the simple, hand-painted sign. Finally, he walked in. Elias was at a workbench, his hands deep inside a complex diesel injector system, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't look up immediately. He finished tightening a calibration screw with a delicate touch before wiping his hands on a red rag and turning to face his visitor. "Julian," he said. It wasn't a question or an accusation. It was just a statement of fact. "Elias, Mr. Thorne," Sterling stammered, his eyes unable to meet the old man's gaze. I came to." He didn't seem to know why he was there. To apologize, to ask for something, to witness the finality of his own destruction. "I lost everything," he said, the words tumbling out hollow and defeated. "The company, the money, my father's legacy. They're suing me into the next century. I'm ruined." Elias nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. He gestured to the engine on his bench. "This is a Mark IV combine harvester, beautiful machine. But the company that bought them out started using cheaper injectors made in China to save $3 a unit. Now they fail under high load. A farmer in Kansas lost half his crop last week when his failed mid-harvest. People get hurt." He looked back at Sterling, his eyes piercing. "Cutting corners on things you don't understand always has consequences." Sterling flinched as if struck. "I know," he whispered. "I was a fool, an arrogant fool. I had everything and I didn't understand any of it. I just knew how to sell it." He looked around the workshop, at the organized tools hanging on the pegboards, the complex schematics pinned to the walls, the quiet, purposeful hum of real work being done. "You built all this again. From nothing." "I never had nothing," Elias corrected him gently. "I had this." He held up his greasy, calloused hands. "This is the only thing that's real, the work." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant whir of a lathe. Julian Sterling, the man who had tried to conquer the world with smoke and mirrors, looked utterly broken. He had come here for something, absolution perhaps, a chance to undo the past. But Elias Thorne was not a priest. He was an engineer. He dealt in what was real and what could be fixed. "I can't give you back what you lost, Julian," Elias said finally. His voice was not unkind. "That was yours to lose. But a man has to start somewhere." He picked up a broom that was leaning against the workbench. It was new and sturdy, a far cry from the worn-out mop he had once carried as a badge of his exile. He held it out to Sterling. "The floor needs sweeping." Julian stared at the broom, then at Elias. He searched the old man's eyes for mockery, for a hint of cruel, poetic revenge. He found none. He saw only a simple, practical offer, an offer of work, a first step. Humiliation had been the beginning of Sterling's downfall. Now, humility was being offered as the first rung on a long, hard ladder back to something real. With a trembling hand, a hand that had once signed 9-figure deals, Julian Sterling reached out and took the broom. And so their destiny was forged, a new legacy built from the ashes of the old. Their story now belongs to time, but its power only grows if shared. True mastery whispers, arrogance shouts, and you can never, ever buy experience. But as one man breaks the system that discarded him, another finds himself trapped by the one he created. What happens when the machine you build to achieve your freedom becomes the very thing that imprisons you? If this journey marked your soul, leave a like and subscribe. For the best stories are those that refuse to die in silence.